Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hello and welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Williams, and we're here to help you make the most of your minerals and royalties. And this episode, we're going to talk about mineral rights news and energy news for April of 2025. And some breaking news, Justin, just before we hit record, I was going through the articles we had picked for this month and have an update on the whole OPEC situation. They have an announcement that they just released today. It's Thursday, April 3rd, when we're recording this. And so we'll dive deep into that. And then the market is in shock with the recent tariffs that just went into effect a couple of days ago. So we'll unwind all of that and talk about how that could affect oil and gas prices. Justin, the Trump administration has been making our job easy as far as finding news articles to talk about related to energy and all that.
You said it, man. Yeah, no, there's a plethora, that's for sure. And so many different angles you can look at it from. And as you mentioned with the breaking news, so right now we're having somewhat of an oil price crash at 7% based on Trump's tariffs. And then really the huge catalyst for the oil price was the OPEC ramp up. That was something that was kind of unseen. They released today. And 8 of the OPEC plus nations announced Thursday that they'll raise output by 411,000 barrels per day. And that'll start in May, which is triple the anticipated monthly increase. And Matt, anytime OPEC makes a huge shift like that that's anticipated, it certainly takes the market for a roar.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great point, Justin, that the OPEC announcement was a little bit of a surprise. There was speculation that they were actually going to go the other direction and roll back or delay some of those hikes, or maybe balance out with some of the OPEC plus countries making reductions to offset those countries that have been overproducing and exceeding their quota. A good example of that is Kazakhstan, who has really historically exceeded their production tariffs by quite a bit. I want to say almost like 500,000 barrels per day. And so the thought process was, well, okay, if OPEC Plus truly is going to increase production, that it would balance out by actually enforcing the quotas on some countries while maybe easing the production limits in other countries to sort of balance things out. But what ended up happening is today, Thursday, April 3rd, they announced that they are hiking production. And so that was a surprise to the market, which usually when OPEC announces something like that, the oil prices will drop, percent or two. And then kind of in tandem, we had a fresh round of tariffs that were announced earlier this week. And that is causing the markets to really go into turmoil. And that is no exception with oil prices. Now, interestingly, gas prices are up 2+% today. So natural gas is around $4.15 per a million cubic feet, which is up. Whereas oil prices, like Justin mentioned, are down more than 7%, down to $66 a barrel. So, pretty interesting dynamic there, Justin.
Yeah, you said, Matt, and it kind of leads us into our next story here. And, this could be impacting that as well. And the next story here is Trump's trade tactics are driving new liquid natural gas deals. And so Trump is using the threat of tariffs to pressure imports of U.S. liquid natural gas. Several countries, including Asia, are responding by pursuing those deals to avoid potential trade penalties. While some of the nations are complying, there's others like the EU that are exploring diversifying their liquid natural gas sources. And it's been a lot of talk about trying to get those liquid natural gas plants up and running and trying to get exports going to other countries. So interesting that he's using this as a bargaining chip. And it's been a lot of talk, I think, since he's gotten into office. And now we're kind of seeing the outcome of that. So it'll be interesting to see if the UK pushes back, how many countries we get on board with the exports. Yeah, it'll be a fun game to see how it shakes out.
Yeah, it's hard to say what the end game is with these tariffs. I guess Trump only knows, but as far as the threat of additional tariffs, the one thing that he did say in January to the European Union, that they should purchase more LNG from the U.S. to avoid the imposition of tariffs. And so what he said is, quote, the one thing they can do quickly is buy our oil and gas he said, we will straighten that out with tariffs or they have to buy our oil and gas. So very interesting. I have a feeling, and I'm kind of hoping this is the case, that the tariffs are being used as a bargaining chip, to your point, Justin, and that we'll get better deals and maybe more, basically sources for U.S. goods and services and products like particularly oil and gas, which is very easy for us. And we're a leader in export. That's the one thing that we do produce a lot of that we export to other countries. We've sort of offshored most of our manufacturing, and I think it's going to be hard to bring that back. And tariffs, I don't know that they're necessarily going to have the intended effect. And so if those tariffs are used as a temporary measure to get better deals in place for U.S. companies, for export terminals to have a destination for those LNG cargoes, that would be great, and it would be very bullish for the natural gas market in the United States. So I think that'd be really interesting to see if that is maybe the primary driver for these tariffs in Europe and in Asia too. And so there's definitely a few countries that have announced that they will be buying more U.S. LNG. So that was pretty interesting to see those announcements come pretty soon after Trump made those statements.
You said it, Matt. Yeah, and the EU has said a lot about trying to diversify, but no, they haven't really specified what exactly that means. And in geopolitical stage, they don't have a ton of really great sources. In 2022, the EU moved away from dependence on Russian gas as an alternative. So it'll be interesting to see if this is just kind of saber rattling or if they really do end up increasing imports from the United States rather than decreasing, or where else they're going to find that supply from.
Yeah, that's a great point. And with Russia only supplying around 10% of Europe's gas, that has a chance to increase if we were to remove sanctions and if, there were to be a longstanding peace between Ukraine and Russia. I'm sure that there would be more gas going to Europe from Russia. But in the meantime, maybe this is a good opportunity to solidify some of those long-term contracts to export LNG to Europe before that happens. And so that if those sanctions are lifted, that U.S. suppliers would still have a foot in the door. So yeah, really interesting dynamic going on there with energy markets. And I think a lot of these tariffs are related to trying to get those exports into, more longer term situation. So yeah. And then, related to other exports, Justin, you want to talk about this next article?
And we've talked about this, I believe, in our last news episode, Matt, where Trump was really taking a really hard stance on the Venezuelan oil. And he continues to drive that home with imposing secondary tariffs on countries that import oil from Venezuela. And China is the likely main target with this. It would be an additional 25% tariff on all trades with the U.S. And the U.S. has never deployed tariffs in such an expansive way before. And it really is, trying to encourage the global stage to get away from Venezuelan oil. And it'll greatly impact the tariffs. And again, Matt, this seems like it's being used as a bargaining chip in trying to shift some of the markets. And who knows how this will end up working out. And Matt, the article goes on to say that Beijing will likely ditch Venezuelan barrels as a consequence, leading to a supply disruption around 300,000 barrels per day. So there are some changes happening, Matt, from this. And it'll be interesting to see if this is a bargaining chip that continues to hold and what the pushback might be from other countries.
Yeah, it'll be very interesting because this whole secondary tariff thing, it's not a direct tariff like on China, for example. If it's saying, well, you're buying your oil from Venezuela, we're going to charge you a 25% tariffs on all trade with the US, in addition to anything else that's there. It seems like, I don't know if that would be the case. It seems like that would be pretty significant. But yeah, for the intended effect is to put additional sanctions on Venezuela without doing it directly. This is one way that they have leverage over Venezuela. This is a thing that I need to learn more about as far as why this is being done. It's the allegations are that Maduro sent gang members to the United States. And so I don't know if that is truly the case. I guess they must have some intelligence that would indicate that. And so this is fallout or is kind of punishment for doing that if that is the case. But yeah, kind of an interesting move. Not really sure how it's all going to play out. If this is going to be, again, just a bargaining chip, it seems like with Venezuela, and then we'll see if this thing sticks. And then, the other thing is, what is China going to do? Because China is definitely playing the long game. And that's one thing that we have a hard time doing here in the US. I feel like, from each administration, we have a short-term view, whereas they're looking at things 100 years from now. And that's how they're moving their chess pieces based on what their goal is 100 years from now. If we had that long-term vision, then it might be interesting, some of these moves, if they were going to achieve some long-term goal, but I just don't know that that is actually the case here. So we'll see whether this ends up sticking as well, but it seems to be disrupting the oil markets. And this is one thing I will say is having a bit of a bullish impact on oil prices. And the reason I say that is because if we're taking 300,000 barrels per day of Venezuelan oil off the market, well, that's, less supply there. So I guess the one benefit from this move is that with OPEC increasing production, we're offsetting a very small amount of that with this Venezuelan tariff. So I guess to the extent that it's helping oil prices, maybe that's a good thing, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah, and there's a related article here that says that Venezuela's oil exports have fallen 11.5% month over month from March. So it is having an impact on the amount that's being exported. European firms are also looking at scheduling the last cargoes before the wind down deadline. So it is having an impact, and it'll be interesting to see if we start to see the uptick. And Matt, that leads us into the rig count here, which is lagging. But, we're not quite seeing the drill baby drill going on yet.
Yeah, like we predicted earlier this year, we're not seeing a large increase in drilling. I don't expect that to happen, certainly with oil prices falling and being below $70 a barrel. What we've seen is sort of the new status quo of less than 600 rigs operating. We are at 575 land rigs, which is down one from a week ago, and that's down 26 from a year ago. The places where we lost two rigs was New Mexico and Pennsylvania, and we added a rig in Ohio. So the major basins that had a change were adding a rig in the Granite Wash and the Haynesville. We lost a rig in Marcellus, lost three rigs in the Permian, but they're still at 297 rigs operating, which is well above any other of the basins or plays. And then Utica added a rig and they're at 12 total. So it's good to see some activity in Ohio for those of you who own minerals and royalties in Ohio. As part of that Utica play, that's definitely getting a lot of attention and is turning out to be, I think, as good as a lot of the companies hoped. So, pretty bullish for that area, pretty steady and active in the Permian still. And then every other location is pretty much the same as before. So, yeah, seeing a little bit of an increase in gas-focused plays, in particular with the Haynesville and then the Utica, which is a bit of a mix depending on which part of that play you're in. So very interesting shift a little bit to natural gas. And that might be the theme this year, Justin, is if oil prices lag and gas prices keep increasing, then we might see a little bit of a refocus on natural gas this year.
Yeah, you said it, Matt. And like we've talked about previously this year, if we're going to see a major impact in rig increase, it's probably going to be either very close to the end of this year or next year that we start to see some increase. They're really just working a plan. But like you said, man, it's interesting to see the shift to natural gas, and perhaps that will be the theme. In the Permian, I know there's a lot of wells which are reaching a point that they may not be profitable to continue to operate those. And especially as the price of oil falls, that's just going to kind of move the target on when it might be time to stop occurring those expenses for the payoff of what the well's producing.
Yeah, that's a good point. And interesting with the Permian in particular, that the natural gas takeaway capacity is the big constraint there. And with all the additional drilling that's still occurring with, 297 rigs and the efficiency increases and all of that, we're seeing more and more gas, associated gas that's coming out of the Permian. Well, they are definitely building new pipelines, but there was an article this morning, actually, on RBN Energy that talked about whether or not the Permian Basin is already out of natural gas takeaway capacity. So we had some additional pipelines that became operational last year, and the Waha hub, which is the major trading hub in the Permian Basin for natural gas, we saw prices increase, but now cash prices are dropping again, which was a bit of a surprise, as the market was sort of seeing, okay, there's additional takeaway capacity that's going to help prices there. And certainly for those of you that own minerals and royalties in the Permian, you've seen very low gas prices that you're getting paid. And that's the reason, is there's just a glut of gas in that area. And these pipelines are supposed to help take it away, but now they're already getting filled with all the new production that's coming online. So that's the one challenge. I will say locally, within the Permian, gas prices are still going to remain challenged this year, it looks like. But other areas that are closer to some of these new LNG export facilities, particularly the Haynesville Shale, which is right next door to where most of these are, and maybe the Marcellus a little bit to a lesser extent, are going to see more advantaged gas prices. But yeah, good to see that. At least one bright spot is that gas is usually green. When I look at the ticker, it's usually up, even if oil is down quite a bit. So the silver lining to, I guess, everything, in that we're getting some additional LNG deals inked, and that's helping the gas prices, and will certainly help, as there's that additional demand for our natural gas that we're producing a lot of here in the United States.
You said it, Matt. Yeah, I'll be interested for our next news episode so we can kind of unpack, what was the longer term effect of these, and is this just a blip, or is this going to cause some pain? So I'm sure there's a lot of conversations being had right now. We'll see what happens.
I agree. All right. Well, that wraps up this month's news episode. As always, you can find links to the articles we discussed at mineralrightspodcast.com. And if you have an article or a question you'd like answered in a future episode, send us an email to feedback@mineralrightspodcast.com. Thanks again for listening. Thanks, Justin.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.